Hello everybody. Today we are going to begin a new unit. So in the last unit, you all became ecologists, or at least you learned a lot of the ways ecologists think and some of the principles of ecology and ways to think about and analyze ecosystems. Now what we want to look at is how human society creates environmental issues. Now, this is a new unit for me, and I'm very excited about it because it brings in a lot of issues that I've had to give short shrift to in the past. Some of the issues we're going to cover are human use of primary productivity, the loss of wilderness, deforestation, the effect of human agriculture on the environment, and the addition of massive amounts of nutrients to ecosystems, both aquatic and terrestrial. Now, as I go through each of these, I'm going to present an overview of it, but then I'm also going to tell you what the effects are. So I am going to go relatively quickly through those effects. And what you should do is, if you do not understand them, come to class with questions so we can flesh out the logic of those consequences of human activity. Let's get started. The first issue we're going to talk about is human appropriation of net primary productivity. Let's talk about what net primary productivity means. Net primary productivity is the net amount of solar energy converted into plant organic matter as a result of photosynthesis. So let's talk about that. It's going to be expressed in units of energy or biomass because we know that those things are rough equivalents of each other. It ranges from about 1,000 to 20,000 kilograms of plant biomass per hectare per year. So let's just talk about that for a second. A hectare is about a football field squared, so about 2 football fields laid side by side. An international soccer field is a little larger than a conventional American football field. It's only about 1.4 international soccer fields. And let's go back and look at what net means. Net means the total amount of photosynthesis minus all the metabolic losses, all the losses needed to keep the plant alive and cells functioning. You will notice that the unit is either an amount of energy or amount of biomass per unit area, per unit of time, usually taken as a year. So hectares, square kilometers, square meters, those are all area measurements you may see in statistics for NPP. Now, the actual measurement of net primary productivity is tricky because you can imagine if it's an annual plant, you can cut the whole thing off. And the same with a perennial herbaceous plant called a forb. You can cut that off at the stem and measure how much dry weight is produced. But with a tree, the only measure that's easy to get is how big the circumference is, or the diameter is, of the tree trunk. And so those then you have to use, and then you have to rely on people who have actually chopped down whole trees and measured their biomass and then made a linear regression out of that. So measuring net primary productivity is not straightforward, and there have been a bunch of scientists who have worked on that in the past so that we can make these measurements. Now, if I were to ask you what are the world's most productive ecosystems, you should take a minute to think about that, maybe pause the videotape, and then I'm going to show you a chart. I think you'll be surprised. Well, you probably said tropical rainforest, and there it is. Yes, indeed, one of the most productive. But did you realize that swamps and marshes are also that, especially salt marsh, and some of the swamps in the mid-Atlantic are incredibly productive as tropical rainforests, even though they cannot produce year-round. And also estuaries. Estuaries are those areas of bays, salt marsh, where you have fresh water on one side and ocean water on the other side. And they're usually protected by some sort of barrier beach. And these are incredibly highly productive. The next most productive are temperate forests, like the ones we have on the East Coast. And then the northern spruce forests, like occur in most of Canada and Northern Europe and Russia. So those are the most productive ecosystems. The only thing missing from this chart are coral reefs, which are on par in their primary productivity with swamps, marshes, tropical rainforest, and estuaries. So humans take some amount of that primary productivity every year, and we call that human appropriation of net primary productivity, or HANPP, a really horrible word to try to say. And you're already familiar with this because you've read about it. Until the 1990s, nobody tried seriously to estimate how much of the total plant productivity on Earth was used by humans. Now, you should fact check me on that. I would love to see if there were estimates from before that. The earliest I could find in a quick search was 1990s, but I'd love to get fact checked on that one. The results have ranged from about 3% to 39%, but the best studies seem to indicate that humans appropriate about 30% of the net primary productivity, which is on the high end of the original study's estimates. Despite our huge population in comparison to other mammals our size, humans still only represent about 0.5% of the heterotroph biomass on Earth. Now, that's 1/200th, and that may sound small to you, but stop and think about it for a while. There are at least 1 million species of heterotrophs on Earth, and humans are probably a secondary consumer. And remembering the 10% rule, that means that humans should have about 1/10 at most of the biomass of the primary consumers. And since there are thousands upon thousands of secondary consumers, we should only be a fraction of that 1/10. And so you can see that having 1/200th when there are 1 million species of heterotrophs at a bare minimum, we have really exceeded our ecological place. One of the things that you learned when you studied net productivity patterns in the globe is that some areas use much more of their NPP and other areas use less. So some areas need to import NPP while other areas can export it. What is the impact of using all this NPP? Well, right off the bat, it means that it's not available for other species. I would say that's the first impact. We are hogging stuff that other species could use, and therefore that's going to have an effect on the population size of other species. Now, if we look at maps of human appropriation of net primary productivity, here's what we see. In the top map, we see HANPP just as a measure of grams of carbon per year in these areas. So it's been mapped out using a geographical information system. The bottom map is probably more informative because in areas that are orange or purple, these are areas where people are using more than 100% of the local net primary productivity. So basically you can see any place that's orange or purple is being subsidized by the places that are green and blue. And the places that are yellowish are getting very close to using all their primary productivity. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about what that means in our class discussions. Let's move on to the second issue. Humans have affected most of the land and water area on Earth. Now let that sink in. In a recent study, only 23% of the terrestrial land area, not including Antarctica, and 13% of the marine area are considered wilderness. It's amazing we've had a larger effect on the oceans than we have had on land. That means that 77% of the land area is used and heavily affected by humans. Between 1993 and 2009, an area of wilderness the size of India was lost to the globe. So we are still losing wilderness at an alarming rate. The impact is that species in most areas where humans live have to adapt to human disturbance or suffer reduced populations. And the problem with reduced populations is it makes a species more likely to go extinct. Now, if we want to look at where is the wilderness, you can see it on that map that I just showed you. But what I wanted to point out is that 5 nations, Russia, Canada, the United States, Brazil, and Australia, contain 70% of the world's wilderness. There are several philosophers who have now come out and put forth an argument that says humans need wilderness to be fully whole as human beings. We evolved in the wilderness, and our psyche, our very nature, our well-being depends on the occurrence of wilderness and to our ability to access wilderness. I'll let you think about that and think if you think that's important. Wilderness has become a divisive concept because of these reasons. Modern conservationists see wilderness as a place untouched by humans. But anthropologists see that humans have affected their environment forever, and that even places that appear to be wilderness have had humans living within them. And so for anthropologists, the question for them is how humans interact with the environment, not whether humans interact with the environment. Duh, humans always interact with the environment. So let's see how this is played out. Each accuses the other side of romanticizing, and let me try to explain that. Conservationists believe in a wilderness that anthropologists claim has never existed because humans have been all over the globe for a considerable amount of time. And so even North America, which appeared to be wilderness to European settlers, was not wilderness to native people. They didn't even have a concept of wilderness. They just had a concept of an environment within which they lived, of which they were a part, and which they were beholden to for their supply of goods and services. Anthropologists see native and traditional cultures as purely interacting with their environment in a sustainable way and don't see that indigenous cultures or traditional cultures may have harmed the environment or may have affected it in a very negative way. So let's talk about the problem with each side's view and how we might resolve it. The notion of wilderness is fraught with these double meanings and with hidden meanings. If you see wilderness as a place without humans, then the implication is that humans can only be bad for the environment. In a sense, we don't need to have a conversation about sustainable living because humans can never be sustainable. It's our nature to destroy the planet, so population reduction becomes the only or the primary goal of environmentalists. As you can probably tell, that argument doesn't sit well with me because we've already seen that population is not responsible for many of the environmental problems. Additionally, if wilderness is good enough to accommodate the rest of nature, then we can also avoid a meaningful conversation about sustainable living for a little while longer because nature's doing fine over in the wilderness and here we are living and some nature's there too, and so it's all going to work out. As you can probably tell, that's not a position I feel comfortable with. Looking at the other side of the argument, it is clearly true that native people have been deprived of their ability to live in a sustainable or at least a low impact way by the civilized world. Think of European expansionism, colonialism, and imperialism. And you can see that indigenous people have been pushed aside. And you can see that indigenous people aren't the people who have created the environmental problems that now trouble us. And you could see why they would feel, hey, this isn't a problem we created. Why should we have to change our ways of life, which haven't created these problems in the first place? But if you see indigenous people as only living sustainably, then you underestimate the damage that can be done by the viewpoint that the world is your pantry. And to see that, all we have to look at is the extinction of the megafauna. Those are the large animals that occurred in North America and Australia in the few thousand years after the arrival of humans in each place. And then it's difficult for you to see that the selective adoption of modern technologies by native people, for example, chainsaws in the Amazon, can really increase damage quickly in places. There has to be accommodation there too. So how do we resolve this conflict? That's the big question. And I want you to think about that. And that's a question for you to think about in your lives as you go forward as thinking, participating citizens. In my opinion, the humble one that it is, neither viewpoint is completely right or wrong. They are two sides of a dialectical argument, and the way forward is to integrate these two approaches and look at where each one has a correct idea. On the one hand, humans are a product of nature, and we are a part of nature, and we are beholden to the ecosystems. But on the other hand, we have distanced ourselves from nature through our human society, and we now have created problems that have a tremendous impact on the ecosystem. So in the first sense, there is nothing that isn't natural. Anything a human does is natural. In the second sense, the products of social systems that significantly impact ecosystems become not natural or synthetic or man-made, which might be better said to be human-made, but women may object because men have been in control for so long and have created most of these problems. So maybe we should say man-made. By remaining unresolved, this conflict in the two uses of natural and not natural, obviates the need to have modern society become sustainable, or at least to discuss how to become sustainable. And by obviates, I mean allows us to put off the discussion. So moving forward, I would love to hear in our next class, when we have a discussion, how you feel about wilderness and about resolving this conflict, and about how you feel about human appropriation of net primary productivity. Does this show us that we have really overpopulated the planet? Is this an area where we can say human population is too large? Well, let's talk about that next time. So I hope this has been a good introduction to how humans affect ecosystems and then the problems that those cause. And I can't wait to discuss this with you. And until next time, study hard.